Now, Deputy Dr. Michael Harty.
Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. And thank you very much, Minister, for taking this debate and giving us an opportunity to express our views. It is very hard to see how Ireland can prepare for a Brexit when the UK, who has voted to leave the EU, do not know the terms in which they wish to leave. In fact, the definition of Brexit is very difficult because it means many things to many different people, and there is no clarity on the issue. Thus, we are in a vacuum, and we find ourselves in a vacuum even today to try and clarify what we want from this process. And there are 5 possibilities, 5 scenarios, I believe, that are presented to us. The first is a no-deal Brexit, which is a chaotic, disorderly Brexit, which will be the worst-case scenario for everybody, particularly for ourselves. And that looks like increasingly the outcome as we approach the 29th of March. But we hope that that will not happen. A no-deal Brexit, a no Brexit at all, that we do not experience Brexit, that the UK decides to leave the issue behind and not to leave the EU, and that would solve all our problems. The third scenario is a negotiated withdrawal agreement, which is the best worst option, and it's the option that we have at the moment. It would allow for an orderly withdrawal and allow for a transition period to negotiate the trading relationship which the UK will have with the EU, and it will ensure that there will not be a hard border between the north and the south of Ireland, and it will also support the Good Friday Agreement. The fourth option is an extension of the deadline for completing the withdrawal beyond the 29th of March. And that looks again like an increasingly likely outcome. However, a prolonged extension of the withdrawal will lead to particular problems, in particular in relation to the European Parliament elections, which will be coming up at the end of May. And it will present difficulties for the UK whether they're going to contest those elections or not. And finally, if there can be a new withdrawal agreement, some alteration to the agreement that has been agreed so far, and that would accommodate the wishes of the UK Parliament. So we're presented with those 5 particular scenarios, and planning for each one of those scenarios is going to be substantially different. Prudently, you would plan for the worst and hope for the best. Ireland will be the most vulnerable of all the EU states, but the Netherlands and Denmark will be substantially affected by Brexit, and we should link with those countries to examine what they are doing in relation to their preparedness for Brexit. Brexit will undoubtedly affect our welfare and our standards of living. So, Minister, refusing to openly discuss the possibilities or the probabilities of a border on this island, I think, is not an option any longer. Nobody wants a return to a border of any type, neither in this arrangement or in any other arrangement, but we must face the fact that it is a distinct possibility. And we have to look at how dependent we are on Britain as being part of the EU, and look at what it means to us if Britain should leave the EU. We have to look at our energy security, our food security, our medical products and how we will deal with importing those, our financial services. We have to look at transport, not only in our ports but in our airports and significantly in our roads. And the haulage industry faces significant difficulties, significant administrative and logistical challenges, and these have yet to be worked out. And how will they affect how we export our goods? It will make some exports virtually impossible if there's going to be long delays at our ports. We have to look at border controls, and yes, there may be border controls, whether they're virtual or whether they're real. We have to look at regulatory alignment, and we also have to look and plan, Minister, for what tariffs will be applied to Irish exports, particularly Irish agricultural exports. Effectively, I believe it will be economic considerations that will dictate what arrangements are arrived at, rather than party political considerations. We have learned 3 things over the past week in relation to how the British government views Brexit. Parliament does not want a deal that has been negotiated over the past 2 years. Parliament does not want a no-deal Brexit. And there appears to be no deal whatsoever which will satisfy the hard Brexiteers. So how do you arrive at a deal while accommodating those 3 items? EU cohesion is very important even if if the UK leaves the EU. But we must maintain EU cohesion, and we cannot allow a member to pick and choose from a menu of articles of association and memorandums of agreement, keeping those which they like and disregard those which they dislike. You cannot be a member of a club and then pick and choose the rules as you see fit. You can be an associate member of a club, but that means you have some privileges, but you do not have any part in decision-making processes. And that is the dilemma that the UK now finds itself in. So the UK needs to decide what it wants and negotiate the best deal that it can get for itself. However, Ireland, Minister, must be proactive in planning for every scenario, no matter how difficult those scenarios might be. You cannot be like Schrodinger's cat, to be alive and dead at the same time. You cannot be both within the EU and outside the EU at the same time. However, there is an intermediate state, which has been outlined in the withdrawal agreement, which allows for a pragmatic arrangement which requires compromise from both sides. And I think the EU has compromised substantially in the withdrawal agreement by allowing Northern Ireland, I think, a golden card of being within the EU and within the UK at the same time, being allowed to trade within the UK and allowed to trade within the EU. But for the Republic of Ireland, we have the backing of the EU, and we would expect the EU to support Ireland in its time of need, if the worst comes to the worst. Ireland will have to plan legislatively to accommodate a no-deal Brexit, and we need to see that legislation as soon as possible, Minister. And I understand there are 40 to 70 pieces of legislation that will have to be passed. We need to see those as soon as possible. Ireland will have to make very painful budgetary adjustments if there is a no-deal Brexit, and we need to know what those budgetary adjustments are going to be. And I believe that Ireland will have to get financial support from the EU to blunt the economic shocks, both nationally and at an individual company level. And we must define what we require from the EU and ensure that we do get that support. Undoubtedly, there are going to be bottlenecks in supplies of raw material for manufacturing and also finished products, particularly medication, and we need to define what those are. And undoubtedly there will be bottlenecks in our ports and at our border crossings if there is a no-deal Brexit. Already companies are making decisions based on a no-deal Brexit before Brexit has arrived, and that has been going on for the past number of years. So Brexit is having an effect before it actually arrives. So I would say to the government that openly planning for a no-deal Brexit is not a sign of weakness. It is not a sign of acceptance that a no-deal Brexit will happen, but it does make common sense. I believe the Irish government has done everything it could to accommodate the UK in delivering their version of Brexit. But we now need to be pragmatic and look to ourselves and how we are going to deal with that scenario. So we must make plans which openly mitigate every scenario, particularly a no-deal Brexit. Minister, I'd just like to refer to the Good Friday Agreement, and I believe the Good Friday Agreement is at risk if there is a no-deal Brexit, because it is predicated on both Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland being both parts of the EU. If Brexit interferes with this joint membership, it puts the Good Friday Agreement at risk. In effect, the EU is a third-party custodian of the Good Friday Agreement. In effect, imposition of a border is effectively putting the Good Friday Agreement at risk. Northern Ireland leaving the customs union and the single market means a border to protect the integrity of the EU customs and single market, and it must be put in place in some form or other. And there is a warning: breaking an agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, is contrary to international law, and it will nullify the last 50 years of Anglo-Irish relationships, which have been very steadily built up, and it could lead to a return to violence. So, Minister, I believe it will be impossible to prepare satisfactorily for every scenario, but I believe we must confront the issue of a no-deal Brexit. And finally, it is of the utmost importance that the EU remains united, and it is also of the utmost importance that the EU does not lose sight of its long-term strategic interests, which are also Irish interests. Thank you.